We have two books. This is Nicholas Alexiou, Department of Sociology, and the Hellenic American Project, Queen's College CUNY. And this is in the series of oral history interviews. And today we're very pleased, very happy and honored to have Tina Bucuvalas, a folklorist, a researcher, a woman of the world, doing very important research on many different things. And Dr. Bucuvalas, Tina, thank you very much for accepting to have this interview with the Hellenic American Project. Welcome.
Well, thank you. And it's an honor that you've asked to do this interview. I appreciate your work.
Let's start with the personal biographical sketches. Where you were born, where you grew up, and you had your early education.
Well, I was born in Chicago. My parents were both, so of that post-World War II generation that sort of migrated to Chicago. Well, my mother was from there, and my father went there for school. He became an aeronautical and then an aerospace engineer, but they met while they were both working at Marshall Fields in Chicago, a real Chicago icon, known for Frangos mints, which when you say Frangos mints, everyone assumes they're Greek. I don't know if they're Greek or not, but everyone knows Marshall Fields in Chicago. So I feel like I'm in some way a Chicago product, although we did move away from there by the time I was 8 months old. And my father got his first professional aeronautical engineering job in the Los Angeles area. So as a child, we sort of followed his career, which is the same path that most people in aeronautical engineering or then aerospace engineering follow. So we lived in Los Angeles. Then he went to work near St. Louis for McDonnell company that was still aeronautics, then Boeing near Seattle, and then back to the Los Angeles area where he went into aerospace and worked on, Gemini, Apollo.
The roots of the family, where they came from.
Okay. Now, my mother was not Greek. She was Czech, really Bohemian from the Chicago area. My father was Greek. His parents were both from Peloponnesos. His father was from the village of Pyrrhos in Mani. And my grandmother was from Amikles, right outside of Sparti.
As a child, you had a chance to visit Greece and some of the places there.
No, not as a child. And sadly, my father never visited it at all. Although he grew up speaking Greek, his mother never learned to speak English. He grew up very much in a Greek community, but he never did get to Greece, although he got to other parts of Europe during World War II. So I didn't visit Greece until I was in college.
But you had a sense that from your father's side, you had a Greek background. How that worked for you?
Well, it was a very strong Greek background. Since when I was young, we frequently visited his family, which was in Lowell, Massachusetts, which was known early on as the Athens of America. And in fact, until I was maybe in my 20s, I thought everybody in Lowell, Massachusetts was Greek because those were the only people I met, except for my Uncle Jimmy and Aunt Joanne, who were Italian. That was it, So when we went there, it was Greek culture all the way. Just very strongly Greek background. So.
How do you identify yourself as far as concerned ethnicity?
Um, although I'm half Czech, I I've noticed in my family, and I've noticed with a lot of other people who have sort of dual ethnicities, there tends to be a more dominant ethnicity of the two, and often it's related to the family's relationship, with one side of the family or another. And in my case, I think the dominant ethnicity in the family was Greek, and we certainly had more relatives on that side of the family and visited them more frequently. So I had more of a sense of being Greek and not as much of a sense of the Czech side, especially since that family was quite small, and my great grandparents came over, whereas on my father's side, my grandparents came over, and in many ways never really acclimated to mainstream American culture.
Yeah, because you lived in a very multicultural environment. Chicago was a laboratory of ethnicities and races, right? And the first school of sociology was there, a lot of studies on ethnicity and race, and also later in California. So, so
Yes,
you grew up in a very multicultural environment, right?
I did. And in fact, except for visiting my relatives, well, I think, we always had some Greek friends, in California, or when my father worked near St. Louis, we always had a sort of set of Greek friends. But for the most part, I grew up in mainstream American communities, not Greek communities. So, at the same time, my parents came from such dominant ethnic neighborhoods, that I sort of felt as a child as kind of a cultural anthropologist, because I was trying to understand mainstream America, and I was sort of translating between the ethnic backgrounds of my parents and mainstream America all the time. And I understood very early that there were different cultural systems.
But even in your studies in university, where there were classic department, let's say, so Greece was in your mind or in the back of your head to learn more about Greek culture, or
Yeah, yes, though I would say not. I mean, like most Greek American children, and this is an aspect of Greek American culture, I grew up with a lot of emphasis on Greek mythology, ancient Greek mythology. And in fact, when I was in college, I couldn't decide what major to have, and I was trying to decide between anthropology, psychology, and mythology, which was a part of the religious studies department. And really, up to the last minute, I couldn't decide. And I finally went with mythology within the religious studies department, because I wanted to do my thesis. I wanted to write a thesis, not just take tests. Although, as it turned out, the thesis that I wrote was not about Greek mythology, but was about a different mythological figure. But that in turn led to me going into the folklore and mythology department for a master's at UCLA. And I went in on the mythology side, but came out on the folklore side, because I found it much more fun to be working with living people and talking to them about their culture, than just to be dealing with texts. So, but it wasn't really until I went for my PhD studies at Indiana University, and I was choosing areas of specialty. And my areas of specialty were Latin American and Greek at that time. So I was taking courses in both of them. And although I wanted to specialize in Greek folklore, I ended up actually doing my dissertation and specializing more in Latin American studies. And I have also a minor in Latin American studies and cultural anthropology, because I recognized I was much more likely to get jobs in that area.
Excellent. And then you started working as a folklorist. It was there in UCLA, in California, or in other states or cities?
I started working, well, after UCLA, I did get an assistantship for a year back in Santa Cruz, where I went for a year or two before leaving the state for the PhD, because there was no PhD program in folklore at that time in California. So I had to go out of state to continue my studies. But otherwise, I didn't work in my field until I was a PhD student, because in fact, the field of public folklore only developed in the 1970s. And there were no opportunities for work in the public sector until almost the time that I was a graduate student at Indiana. And then after I finished my courses, I was actually supporting myself by doing contract work in public folklore in various places around the country.
And especially Florida?
Florida didn't happen until 1985, but before that, I worked in New Jersey, Arkansas, Wyoming, Arizona, and then Florida.
And in all those places, they are, or they were, I think some of them still exist, some Greek communities, Greek American communities. You had any contact with the communities while you're doing your own work there?
Yes, well, I can safely say there are Greeks everywhere. And not only are there Greeks everywhere, but in the most out of the way places, I found people who knew distant relatives of mine from Massachusetts. And I'm thinking of people I interviewed in Green River, Wyoming, who knew a second or third cousin of mine. So the only place I didn't meet up with Greeks was in New Jersey, and that's because the research was specifically devoted to Cuban culture.
Interesting. So you have a cultural background, you grew up in multicultural environments, and all this influence your work, your interest, right?
Yes.
Various cultures.
Yes, and let me also say that, growing up in California predominantly, I not only did I have a personal varied background and in these places, but the schools that I went to were predominantly Mexican or Chicano, so I grew up after a certain point with those cultures. And while in California, as an undergraduate, at some point, I started studying Spanish because at some point I realized or was told that by the year 2000, half of the population of California was going to be native Spanish speakers. And it just seemed obvious that that should be part of everyone's skill set, if they were planning to work in the state.
Well, from your research, your experience, do you see any similarities or any differences between the Greek American cultures and the other cultures? You find some commonalities there?
Certainly, and the commonalities, I think, vary from culture to culture. I think I see the most similarities between Greek and Latin American cultures, because they do have a Mediterranean foundation to some extent. Latin American cultures can be very different depending, Mexico and Argentina and Cuba are incredibly different, you know, because they have different mixtures of Indian and African and European, but they all have that Mediterranean basis in there somewhere. And particularly the emphasis on family, the very strong emphasis on family and music and food. And anyway, I just find temperamentally there's a lot of similarities.
This is very interesting because this is the American experiment. We hear about the various ethnic conflicts in different areas of the world, but from what you say that more or less people are basically the same. They have, you know, some similarities in their struggle to achieve a better life, to share culture, interactions, family values, etc. Right?
Absolutely. And I have to say that being a folklorist and spending a lot of my time interviewing people from all different backgrounds has made me quite an optimist and quite a strong believer in the goodness of human nature, and the fact that we are all fundamentally similar. You know, it's just the culture expresses itself in different ways in different places.
Sometimes it's very difficult for a researcher like yourself to be accepted by a group. Sometimes if they see you as an outsider, maybe it's better because you have researchers have this neutrality, the stranger, as Zimmel argues, or others, right? Or if they know you, they behave differently. You had any challenges as a researcher, as a folklorist, and also as a woman, because it is also another dimension in your research, to be not only a cultural researcher, but also to be a female.
Yes. Yes, there have been challenges at different times, but for the most part, I have found people of all different kinds to be incredibly accepting, and I ascribe that to the fact that people love to talk about themselves and their lives. I mean, if someone's interested, they're happy if someone's interested in what they do and their culture. And there have been relatively few times when I found people will not talk to me. Now, the degree of detail that they get into may differ, but I think that as human beings, we all have such important commonalities, and that as a person who interviews other people, I think you have to have a sort of intuitive sense about establishing with whatever person you talk to your bases of commonality. It may be your children, it may be your job, it may be where you've lived, you know, it may be religion, it could be almost anything, but you have something in common with almost anybody that you talk to. So it's been less difficult than most people would think. And I think because of my job, but also because I grew up in a situation where I didn't always understand Greek, and I didn't expect to. And that was normal for me. So I don't have the expectation to be perfectly comfortable and at home wherever I am. So it's not a problem for me. However, I will say there are degrees of belonging. And as you as you so correctly stated, sometimes if you are part of a group, it then means you are not allowed to be neutral. You know, for instance, if you're Greek, well, do you go to this church or do you go to that church? I mean, do you like that person or did you vote for that person? You know, I mean, what, you know, there are ways you can be divided as well as ways that you can be accepted. And I've been lucky with Latin Americans because I understand enough about their culture. I've lived in Mexico. I lived in Miami, which is virtually Cuba. You know, I'm pretty familiar with a lot of aspects of their culture, and I feel very comfortable, and most of them feel comfortable with me. But after I moved to Tarpon Springs, I had never lived in a Greek community before, and the level of acceptance as one of them, although maybe not in the inner circle of belonging, was overwhelmingly different, you know, and overwhelmingly more than in any other culture I had experienced. So, you know, it's been quite something. You know, I have found not nearly as many challenges as opportunities, actually. And, you know, it hasn't been all with Greeks, of course, but I do deal and have dealt with a lot of very male-oriented activities, ranching. I'm a kind of a maritime specialist, fishing, boat building, sponging, clamming, all of these kind of things, you know, even going out on tugboats and whatever. And what I found is that when I'm a woman in these male occupations, the men bend over backwards to explain it to me. Whereas I think if I were a man, they would be a little kind of short with them because they expected them to know more. Instead, I'm treated very, very kindly, you know. There are occasionally some aspects that men don't want to talk to me about. For instance, well, I guess we can record this. In Tarpon Springs, I knew there was a lot of interaction between the Greek and Black community. And so I started asking if there were marriages or whatever, you know, or what went on in that regard. And the men would not talk to me. You know, later on when I worked with the but they would talk to a male colleague, a male Greek colleague of mine that came and make a lot of comments about that, but not to me. On the other hand, when I was doing research in the African American community, I went to a church one day and I was with this male Greek colleague and I said, oh my God, that woman in the choir looks Greek, you know. And later I asked the pastor and said, you know, that woman looked Greek. And he said, yeah, she is. You know, Greek, you know, she's part Greek. And he told me about these things. But there are these occasional things in which men will not talk to me. And I've even had colleagues try to shut me out by telling, you know, dirty jokes, you know. But for the most part, I found it to be a neutral element, being a woman, that I am allowed both in male and female roles because I myself am liminal, you know, as a professional woman who comes in and acts respectful and interested, and almost everyone is simply willing to talk to me.
Yeah. Before we talk about Tarpon Springs, I would like to say a few things about your experience regarding the research process, because as a scientist, as a researcher, you do your job. Is a job that never stops. Is 24 hours, seven days a week, right? This is the destiny, the fate of researchers like yourself.
Yeah.
So I want to know if there are similarities or differences among different ethnic groups or the American system. So you do your job, you do your research, you do everything. And then what is what is the mechanism? Do you have the mechanism, the institutions to support that, to disseminate this information, this knowledge? Are some communities more open or you know, energetic to communicate your research than others, or you know, it stays somewhere closed in drawers, and instead of coming out, disseminated, creating a dialogue, a public dialogue, educate the new generations?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and there's a lot of different aspects, you know. Um, eh, and you're right. It goes both ways depending on where you are and who you're working for. Now, as a public folklorist, I have worked primarily for, of course, public institutions, sometimes government, sometimes museums. I've worked for state government. I've worked for municipal government. In terms of museums, I've worked for, primarily a semi-private, semi-county museum in the historical museum in Miami. I've worked for a lesser amount of time in shorter term projects for a variety of different places. And every place has different mechanisms of dissemination. What I do is identify, document, and then present to the public in one way or another, aspects of traditional culture in the area, or whatever focus is wanted for a particular project. And the ways in which it is presented to the public differ according to the aims of the institution or to the place itself. So I could be disseminating information to the public often in terms of a festival or an event that showcases a variety of aspects of different culture, kind of like a folk festival, but better contextualized, I would say, more thoughtfully contextualized, than a lot of generic presentations, or through museum exhibits. I've done a lot of museum exhibits. I've also done concerts, and series of musical performances. I've also done workshops to teach people, especially within communities like Tarpon Springs, aspects of their own culture, such as food or music, that they may not otherwise have access to learning. Mm-hmm. And then in addition, I've some of the materials that I generate, which are in the form of audio recordings, notes, photographs, videos, sometimes the institution may keep them. I usually try to see that they go to some kind of archive, some kind of major archive. For instance, I hate to say this, but after having worked for the city of Tarpon Springs for a decade, I realized that all of my work would be lost and shelved if I did not take copies and put it in some other institution, in some other archive, thousands of photos, hundreds of audio recordings, but if that was not put somewhere else, it would have been lost.
I don't want to mean something, but keep in mind the Hellenic American Project here at Queen's College. Right? We're a public institution and we have the archive, so keep that in mind. Right?
Okay.
I just mentioned it.
Okay.
But also, one of the fundamental issues researchers have, especially in the humanities, it is funding. And funding was always a problem. And do you see that in the past it was easier for social studies, for anthropological studies than it is now? And do you see, because as an academic also, I realize the pressure of the market influencing to certain degree research or through funding and other issues. So academia, especially public institutions, are threatened by the increasing presence of the market and private institutions, and how that affects research.
Well, that's an excellent question. And let me say that in my career, dating back to the 80s, I have usually had a position that was funded by, where my salary was paid by the institution, but almost the entirety of my work, of my research was funded through grants. So in other words, they weren't giving me money to do research, but I constantly did research and public programming, all of it funded by grants. And I remember sitting around in the late 80s thinking, this is all going downhill and all grant funding is drying up. So fast forward to 35 years, and it's exactly the same as it was then, from my perspective. There's still, the grant funding is still there from public sources. The same sources, in fact. I've been going to the National Endowment for the Arts and getting grants for decades. And the same with the Florida Humanities Council, and the same with the Florida Division of Cultural Affairs. NEH is still there to do funding. It's all still there. But there are times when it looks like it's drying up. The place where I haven't had much luck, and I think this is partly me, because it simply hasn't been my area of emphasis, is getting private funding from private individuals or foundations. And to do that kind of thing, you just have to spend a lot of time sort of developing relationships with those places. And I simply found that public funding sources were far more reliable, although they were often small. They might be smaller pots of money. I could count on them every single year, although they were competitive, always, but they were reliable.
So let's talk about now Tarpon Springs, which is a unique place, a very historical place as far as concerns the Greek American community, not only, of course, primarily about the sponge industry and the sponge divers. So, and it is well documented that the early Greek Americans in that industry, they were among the first to hire African Americans on equal pay, and this is unique for America at that time. So, what brought you there, and tell us your experience with the Greek American community.
Oh boy, I don't know where to start. It's a big topic, but certainly it is a unique community, and the only community really initially founded on the sponge industry. Although Key West, Florida had a big sponge industry too, but and it's fascinating that after more than a century, the sponge industry is continuing, though I'm not sure how long it will continue on a production basis. And I think we may have talked about some of these issues when we spoke earlier, which is the issues being that sponging is extremely hard work. And today it's very difficult. Well, first of all, let me say that Greeks, even before they came to Florida, back in Greece, this was something that generations went into. But as the generations, if they got a little money, they preferred that their children did not go into this occupation. They wanted them to become educated and become doctors and lawyers, so that actually Kylimnos had one of the highest number of doctors of anywhere in Greece, precisely because the sponge industry, the wealth, allowed them to do that. So once people get into the industry, they don't necessarily want their family to continue. But one of the only ways to succeed in the industry is actually to have a system where your family is involved in production. Particularly, that's true today because it's very difficult to get young people to go out on boats for weeks or a month at a time, away from electronics, hard work from morning to night. I mean, back-breaking work from morning to night, no cell phone, they just don't want to do it, So there are very few people that do want to do it. There are occasionally very idealistic people who think about, the sea and underwater, which is very beautiful. I used to dive a little, it's fantastic. But work is a different issue, and people don't usually stay in it after they've done it for a while. So I'm afraid that some of the older people are in the industry may be the real end of production in Tarpon Springs. I hope not, but it could be true. On the other hand, there's some very successful sponge distributors who process incoming sponges, both from Tarpon Springs and ones that are bought from the Bahamas. They clean them, they trim them, prepare them for sale, and then ship them off to other parts of the country, or even to Greece, because most of the sponges sold in Greece are not from Greece. They're from the New World, either predominantly the Bahamas, but possibly also Tarpon Springs. So, and then the Greek community. Now, the Greek community in Tarpon Springs started on the basis of the sponge industry. And although the earliest people who were from the island of Egina, very soon after that, people came predominantly from the other sponge producing islands, especially Kalymnos, Halki, and Simi. And that was the basis of the core of the old population, and it's still very active today. I live in Greektown, which was founded by, once the men came, they started bringing their families pretty soon, and they built this area that stretched for quite a ways from the sponge docks area of Tarpon Springs towards the center of town. And right next to that was the African-American community at first, although that kind of moved. And also the Greeks started expanding in that direction too, to take over kind of a big area. But that was another source of contact for the African-Americans and the Greeks. People, that area is still predominantly Greek after more than 100 years. To the extent that just before Easter, there's a sheep in the yard next door to me. It disappears quickly, but when Easter comes around. But a lot of Greek traditions of all kinds are maintained in this area. But people have continued to come in. So the Greek community has expanded outside of the Greektown area. It was starting to expand even in the 30s and 40s to other parts of town. And especially as people became wealthier and wanted bigger houses, they moved into different parts of town. And also to get jobs into the greater Tampa area, which has one of the highest levels of Greek population, to the extent that the Greek government established a consulate in Tampa when ordinarily consulates are just put in mega cities like Atlanta, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles. But there is one in Tampa to serve the people there and the snowbirds that come down from up north in the winter. But I find that since I moved into Tarpon Springs, instead of being part of a mainstream American community, I'm more a part of the Greek community, in terms of my social groups and the activities I do and things like that. And it's a very active community. And there's that basis of the people from the Dodecanisa, from 100 years ago, but who have continued to come. But also there have been a lot of new waves of immigration, mostly post-World War II immigration from all parts of Greece. And very interestingly, it's almost two Greek societies, there's some overlap, but, and I've heard that this differs sometimes. Different organizations, regional organizations will be run by the post-war people, and other regional organizations will be run by the older group of settlers in Tarpon Springs, or a HEPA may be run by a certain group, but they sometimes tend to stick within their own regional Greek groups.
Well, it is documented, the American census, other sources, that the American-born generation, or the American-born Greeks, are numerically more than the Greek-born. So there is a demographic transformation within the community. Mm-hmm. And one of the concerns in many Greek American communities, primarily with the disappearance of the Greek towns. Tarpon Springs is probably, and Astoria here in New York, probably there are two exceptions. They're still, but Chicago or other areas, because what you said, the Greeks moved out, having a neighborhood and social economic mobility. They're moving out from the ethnic center. So do you see a continuity to the Greek American community in that sense, or will be totally assimilated?
No, I think, and you're quite right. I have exactly the same opinion that you do. But what I've seen in Tarpon Springs, but also with Cubans in Miami from when I lived there, is this is also a function of numbers. And if the ethnic community is so numerically dominant, it leads to a greater retention, I think, of culture than if it is not. And that's certainly been true in Miami, and I believe it's been true in Tarpon Springs, because until I believe the 1960s, 50s or 60s, the Greeks were the biggest population element in Tarpon Springs, even though this is not reflected in some of the local histories, which were not written by Greeks. But it is reflected in the census and also in dissertations and theses done about the Greek community. But it's very interesting that, anyway, there is a disconnect. But to go back to your question, is there continuity in Tarpon Springs? Yes. Despite the fact that some of the children are even fourth generation, and even if they don't speak Greek, there are enough cultural activities, and there is enough social cohesion, and there are enough people there who are family and friends who are Greek, that I see them retaining a lot more Greek culture than most other areas. How long that will last, I don't know, but I don't see it dying anytime soon. There is every weekend, or there's an opportunity for some kind of major Greek events, whether they're public or private being, like rites of passage, like, weddings, baptisms, funerals, or whatever. There's always music, there may be, there's religious holidays.
Yeah, they have festivals, all those things.
Yeah. But Greek church festivals, I don't consider very very traditional, but anyway.
Also they visit Greece, right? Overall.
Yes, I mean, and one of the pillars of the community in Tarpon Springs, actually his name is John Lulius, and his brother, you may have heard of him, is Archbishop Nikitas of Great Britain. But he's a local Tarpon boy, but John is a travel agent, and his life is hell for several months out of the year, because such a large population or proportion of the Greeks in Tarpon go to Greece that he is tearing his hair out, with all of the travel plans and changes. Hundreds and hundreds of people leave every summer and spend most of the summer, or at least part of the summer, in Greece. So there is this constant interaction, with Greece itself, more than I've seen in any other community that I can think of.
So, besides your studies on the sponge industry, also you edited a book recently about music.
Yes.
Greek music in America, and I ordered the book from the university that we published it with, and the people there were very, in order to bring it here to the Hellenic American Project library. So the book is here at CUNY College into my library there, into the archives library, and the people who I exchanged emails, they were so not only supportive, but they were very pleased with the book, and in general ethnic music, but particularly this book. And, and I saw that it is this book, it is a work of love, not only from those who contribute, but also people who publish the book and sell it. And that was a really nice thing. I wanted to share it with you. Tell us about the book also. What was the idea, and why all this time we never had, about the significance and the contribution of the Greeks in ethnic music.
Yeah, well, and thank you for telling me that. They are lovely people at the press, and they were very, from the beginning. That is my fourth book with that press, and so I have a long-term relationship with them. And I had already told them I was going to write a book about the sponge industry, and then I had the idea for this book, and I'll talk more about that. And I went to the editor. At that time, he's the editor-in-chief, Craig Gill, who formerly was the editor for folklore books and music books. And he has retained those subjects because he loves them so much. Even as the editor, he didn't want to give it up, the editor-in-chief. But I said, Craig, I'm thinking of doing this book about Greek music in America. Do you think you might be interested? Because they have a very well-regarded series on ethnic music. And he said, wait 1 minute. And he went and he checked a couple things, his list, and he said, we have nothing on Greek music. Can you do this book before the sponge book? He wanted it right away, and was very, positive about it from the beginning. So, and the reason I came, all the books I've done, I've done, well, in the first one I was asked to do, but the other ones have come about because I've seen that they were topics that should be done, but no one had done anything substantial about. And I, throughout my career, for some time, I've presented Greek music in almost every place for some reason, but more intensely in Tarpon Springs, where I worked with a lot of Greek musicians and got to know them very well. And over the years, I've acquired from them primarily more and more of an understanding about Greek music in America. Tragically, one of the musicians I worked with, who was regarded as one of the best in America, died suddenly, and people in town who adored him wanted some of his music because he had recorded on some albums, but nothing just of his stuff. So I got together with his brother and also with Meletios Pouliopoulos, who's a scholar of Greek music in America. I think possibly the most knowledgeable person. And we acquired recordings that were copyright free, that were recorded under live circumstances, and so on and so forth, and put together a CD. And in the process, I wrote the liner notes, and I came to realize there was very little written on Greek music in America. And so because of that, I wrote a grant to do a museum exhibit about Greek music in America. And I did research, and I hired Meletios Pouliopoulos and also Steve Frangos to each do, to each write about certain aspects of Greek music. And then I edited the text together and created the panels, and that was the exhibit. And then I realized that wasn't enough. That there really, I knew from studying about it what was available and what wasn't available. And I knew who wrote and who hadn't written. And I realized there needed to be a book. So that's when I went to Craig and said, would you be interested in the book? You know, so that's how it came about.
Excellent. This is a great story. Was the Greek American community at large, not only in Florida, but other institutions supportive with grants, or how the book was received so far?
No, it wasn't done with grants. I just did it. I just edited it. You know, I've edited books and written and co-written books before, and I've never really had a grant to do that. So it didn't really occur to me to do that. Oh, but I should say also, after the book was published, again, there was the realization that there was no publicly accessible repository, major repository for Greek music in America. And so then I did write grants to a number of institutions. I got very tired of writing grants, but only one of them came through. And that was the National Endowment for the Arts, which funded the Greek Music in America archival project to collect, we collected almost 2,000 items, mostly recordings, but also some associated item ephemera like music and posters and other items. My first thought was to put it in the Library of Congress, but after I actually got a small grant to visit them and discuss that possibility, and I realized they were slow, and it was very difficult to get things happening very quickly, and there was a good possibility it would take years, if not decades, for these things to really be incorporated into their catalog. So actually, we went with the Archives of Traditional Music at Indiana University, which is a wonderful institution, which has as much online public accessibility as copyright allows, and total public accessibility for those who want to go to the archive. You know, and they were absolutely wonderful to work with. So, and again, Miletios Poliopoulos was a really big part of that project.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So in our conclusion, I would like for you to share with us your experience for visiting Greece when you first went there, and how you felt. What does Greece mean to you?
Oh boy. Well, you know, it's very interesting. And I will say that I am now a Greek citizen, which is something I initiated largely for my children's sake, because I thought it might help them in terms of their education and as an EU citizen, but which I have found to be a source of pride for me, you know, and a wonderful thing. So I have to say, when I was 19, I first went to Greece, and I loved it and hated it at the same time. And part of that was that I was a young college student who had never been in a very macho society, and society at that time in Greece had not progressed as much as it has today. So I, traveling as a young American woman who automatically would not have been perceived as morally upright, you know, was not always treated very kindly. But I managed, and it was a wonderful experience meeting my relatives, but I had a hard time, you know, with the very patriarchal, you know, structure at that point. Not to mention that it was during the junta, you know. So I didn't go back until 2004, at which point, you know, I realized I was coming home. I don't know how to describe it, but, I looked around and it's like, wow, everyone here looks like me. I mean, I'm, when I went to Mani, more so, it was clear that in that particular place, people looked more like me as opposed to other kinds, people, I just found quite a connection in terms of attitudes and interests and just um, I don't know, I just really fell in love with it immediately, and felt at home and welcome. And every year since then, I have gone back. One of the best things that's ever happened to me in my career is that I was awarded a Fulbright Scholar Award 2006 to 2007 to do research in Greece on public folklore in Greece. And that led to actually an entire change in my career path. Because I had been up in the air about whether I would study the sponge industry or public folklore, but I also became interested in pursuing the research in the sponge industry. And from that point on, I did so. And that led to me moving to Tarpon Springs ultimately. It also led to some very strong relationships that I maintain to this day with scholars in Greece, folklorists in Greece, with whom even today, I mean, literally today, I was still working, reviewing papers for a publication from a conference that took place in Greece, at which I was the keynote speaker a couple of years. It's really built over the years into very fruitful collaborations with scholars in Greece in a variety of different ways. And they're very interested in public folklore, which has some interesting relationships with the way intangible cultural heritage has developed. It's sort of the same thing, but slightly different paths. So together, we're sort of looking, at the way these things overlap. And in fact, one of the scholars there helped said to me, this book on Greek music in America needs to be published here. And he helped me find a publisher. And in fact, it is in the process and hopefully will be being translated and hopefully will be published in Greece, I hope by the summer, so that would be a wonderful thing because they're quite interested in the topic. So.
Tina, thank you very much for the review. Very, very interesting. Really cover many areas regarding your, and your work with Greece, with Greek American community, and research in particular. You do a very important work. In our conclusion, you're going to tell us about your future plans, research-wise or traveling-wise?
Yes. Well, some of my work I want to finish this book about the sponge industry, which I've been working on documenting that for a decade, but I'm in the process of writing, and hopefully I'll finish that within the year. But I've also lately worked some in historic preservation, especially as dealing with the Greek town area of Tarpon Springs as a traditional cultural property, which I nominated and was listed on the National Register of Historic Place as the first traditional cultural property district recognized in the US. And also the cemetery there was recognized as a traditional cultural property on the basis of Greek culture. And this has also led to some community activism in terms of working with the city to formulate policies that would maintain the character of the Greek town area and not lead so that there wouldn't be overdevelopment and an influx, an enormous influx of other people, so that the culture would be lost in the area. And I think that's an interesting area that I'll probably be involved in for a while. So
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Nicholas. And thank you for the work of your institution for preserving, the history and culture of Greeks in America. I think it's so important.
Thank you very much.